just joining us for the first time, we did record this morning's session, so you'll be able to catch up on that. It'll be posted on the website that we'll give you a link to. And again, I start by thanking the organizers and particularly the organizations that have made this possible. NABC, Partners in Flight, AOS, and of course the Knobloch Foundation. Here's the group of the organizing committee. I flashed this up this morning. It's a lot of names, many of whom you probably recognize, but we appreciate each and every one of them for the role they played in getting us to this point. And for a reminder from this morning and new to whoever's joining us, we are eliminating or disabling the chat between attendees, but we want comments to go to the Padlet that will again be a link will be provided in the chat for you. Again, the comments should go to the Padlet, and if you have questions for the panelists, and we hope you will, please put that in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You'll see that. And they will be monitored and brought up to the panel as time allows. So thank you everybody for joining us again. Welcome back. And I welcome back Ashley Dayer to lead us through this afternoon session on social science and communications. Ashley?
Great, thanks so much, Paul, and thanks everyone for joining us again. Brent Ryder from Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, and I will be tag teaming this afternoon as moderators again, as we did this morning. So as you heard this morning, integrating conservation and social science into bird conservation can improve conservation planning, defining how to address threats and strategies for promoting human behavior change, as well as improving human livelihoods. I was really enthused to see the great questions you all were asking in the question and answer pod and your comments on the Padlet. You're really showing a strong interest in social science insights and questions that social scientists can help provide insights on. So hopefully you'll have a chance to get a lot of those answered here this afternoon. We're going to hear from 3 examples of social science integration for bird conservation on this panel. On the panel, we have a trained social scientist, a biologist who's learned social science approaches through job experience and collaborations, and another biologist who works with social scientist colleagues and brings them together with bird conservation professionals. They're going to share their insights from work on private farmlands in the Great Plains of the US, remote villages of Alaska, and the islands of the Caribbean. You're going to see broad spanning approaches from conservation standards planning to incorporating indigenous knowledge to a project employing a variety of traditional social science methods such as interviews, focus groups, and surveys. While it's not the purpose of the panel, see if you can also catch themes of communications, integration, and co-production. So I hope you all enjoy this panel. We're again going to have each of the 3 panelists give a lightning talk, and then we're going to move to questions and answers. So make sure that you add your questions into that question pod. I'm going to start here by introducing Brad Andres, our first speaker for this panel. He is the co-chair of the Atlantic Flyway Shorebird Initiative's Harvest Working Group at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He's going to be talking about the integration of social and biological aspects of shorebird harvest into the development of effective conservation strategies. Take it away, Brad.
Okay, I'm just making sure. Can you see the? Okay, thanks. Yes, so thanks, Ashley. So I would like to talk about shorebird harvest in the Caribbean today. If I can get this to advance. There we go. Yes, so and the first thing I want to do is talk about the conservation standards process a little bit as a way to integrate human behavior and social aspects right away with biological kind of approaches we may be more familiar with. And all this work I'm going to describe as being accomplished through a working group of the Atlantic Flyway Shorebird Initiative that really focuses on shorebird harvest. And then lastly, I want to just talk a little bit about social context of what we've accomplished and where we need to move forward, and within those contexts of a political landscape, cultural, and economic. So when I was thinking about putting this talk together, I changed things up a little bit because I really wanted to make a plug for using the open standards for the practice of conservation. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, to me, this really gets us thinking about human behavior right off the bat when we're thinking about a conservation issue. And so this is just a quick overview of a situation model where the targets are, non-breeding shorebirds in the Atlantic flyway, and really to address this threat of illegal or unsustainable harvest, and with the goal then of making harvest sustainable. And just kind of to point out, the scope that we've been addressing has been primarily Northern South America, Caribbean, with recognizing maybe some issues in the USA and Canada. And so as we kind of lay out this model of the situation, we try to think about the contributing factors, and those are really indirect threats, or as the word implies, things that contribute to having this conservation issue. And what I did is I outlined the ones here in red that really deal with human behavior or social aspects. So you can see that a majority of the things we think are contributing to this unsustainable harvest really are related to human behavior. And there is this large box which deals with science. And so that's one piece of bringing in the social part. The other piece is on this side of the model, where we can actually specify human well-being targets, in this case, maintaining a culture of shorebird hunting, and then also look at ecosystem services. And so from that, then we develop a series of strategies that are in these yellow ovals to address these contributing factors. And here I just wanted to lay out a couple that we have, again, identified for the shorebird harvest issue. And in this case, the red now are the ones that deal with science. And you can see that there are these other kind of 9 non-scientific strategies that we need to undertake, we believe, to reduce harvest, have sustainable shorebird populations, and then concurrently maintaining this culture of shorebird hunting. So to step into the political context a little bit, it's very complex, the policies that exist even in the small region. And this is really important to understand so that we do develop, I wanted to borrow something from the joint venture world here, and that is spatially explicit conservation actions. And in this case, they're spatially explicit a little bit with geography, but it's about the politics in that geography. And so one of the first steps we took with the group was Brian Watts did kind of a large review of hunting policies and actually, firearm policies throughout the Western Hemisphere. Just to give you an idea of the variability, these are 3 overseas departments of France, French Guiana, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and then an independent jurisdiction, Guyana, the country of Guyana. And you can see even with these, and within the overseas departments, there's a variety of the proportion of shorebirds that are harvested, season length, and then whether or not they have bag limits. So we kind of stretch all the way from Guyana, which is pretty much a free-for-all for shorebird hunting, to French Guiana, where there's not as many species harvested, but have a relaxed bag limit. And just kind of coupled with this is the French system of setting hunting regulations is nothing like we see in the United States and Canada. And I think it took a lot of us quite a while to realize how complex it was, and where we talked a little bit in the last session about where the decisions lie. And here the hunting federations and the hunters as stakeholders have quite a larger say in promulgating regulations for harvest in the French overseas departments. The one thing too that I wanted to kind of point out here is as a solution is we actually developed an MOU between Canadian Wildlife Service, the French hunting agency under their Office of Biodiversity, and then with us, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so that we could cooperatively work on this issue. Really amongst the French overseas departments, but then that model is being able to work with others in the region. So the cultural context, really what we've started looking at is who harvests shorebirds and how those shorebirds are being used. So again, that we can really think about the most effective strategies if we want to reduce the harvest and make it more sustainable. So just an example quickly from Guyana, you know, there's a lot of personal use. They're selling to local markets to fill orders that are given to often fishermen. And one thing that's interesting than most other places is there's commercial selling in markets. And there is this cultural context that shorebirds tend to be used more by the Indo-Guyanese population. So we've done these assessments, social assessments in Brazil, French Guiana, and Suriname. And then just kind of to point to the other side, there's hunting groups that are well organized in Barbados, Guadeloupe, and Martinique. So again, very different social context to think about solutions. And so lastly, I just want to mention the geo kind of economic context to this issue. And focus again on Guyana, where there's just under 800,000 people. 90% of the population lives close to the coast, relatively poor country with a per capita income of about 6,600 US. So daily wage is only $25, average daily wage and minimum is less than 10. So this is important when we look at the value of what shorebirds are sold for, where the harvester can actually exceed their daily wage by 1.4 to 3 times the amount they get from that average daily wage by harvesting and selling shorebirds, or exceed the minimum wage by 3.5 to 15 times. So that means we really need to consider wage substitutes as a possible solution, or at least examine that. And that's sort of our next step, to develop a more thorough study to characterize the social aspects of harvest, including this economic impact. And then also sort of the next steps are really to share the results we have on harvest and what's going on in Guyana with their Wildlife Commission to assess their interest in developing harvest reduction strategies. So a quick overview of the shorebird harvest issue in the Caribbean and Northern South America.
All right, huge thanks, Brad, for giving us that great example of how we can leverage social science to address a key limiting factor for a suite of birds. Our next speaker is Jessica Barnes. Jessica is a research scientist in the Department of Fish and Wildlife and Conservation at Virginia Tech, and she also serves as the NABC social science coordinator. Jessica is going to share insights from a co-produced social science study on landowner decision-making related to grassland conservation through the CRP program, Conservation Reserve Program, with the aim of promoting enduring benefits for birds, land, and people across the Great Plains. With that, Jessica, I'll let you take it away.
All right, there we go. Are you seeing my screen okay? I think it's good. Well, thank you everyone for having me today. Like Brant said, I'm going to share just a little bit about one social science study that we've done to inform bird conservation. So this is specific to landowners and the Conservation Reserve Program in the Southern Great Plains. And the subtitle of this is Co-Producing Social Science for Bird Conservation. And I think you'll see throughout that this is really an example of both of those themes that are running through the workshop, co-production and social science. So I just want to start with describing the bird conservation problem that we're dealing with in this region. So as many of you are keenly aware, a key limiting factor for grassland birds is the loss of temperate grassland habitat. And a major source of that is conversion of privately owned grasslands to cropland. The Conservation Reserve Program is a federal farm bill program that incentivizes the conversion of those croplands back to grassland. In this region anyway, it incentivizes other things in other areas. And that CRP land, those grasslands, are known to support population increases for grassland birds. So if you heard David Pawlacki talk this morning, he mentioned some of their work. And there's a lot of evidence that Cassin sparrow and grasshopper sparrow, eastern meadowlark, lark bunting, all really benefit from this establishment of CRP grassland. The problem is that land is only in CRP for a time, and when it comes out, that land is a primary source of grassland conversion again, back to agriculture. And the key is that contracts on almost 12.5 million acres of land across the country are due to expire from this program, starting 2 years ago and continuing through next year. And so the big question is, how do we stop this bleeding of grassland habitat for grassland birds? So we initiated a social science study. Here's the co-production piece. So like Brant said, I'm a research scientist at Virginia Tech, and I serve as the National Bird Conservation Social Science Coordinator. But this project was really imagined by and implemented by multiple partners. So it's funded by the Farm Service Agency, and many of the questions were really authored by that agency. They're interested in doing this program better. And then our team at Virginia Tech, and we worked closely with the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies and Playa Lakes joint venture, got conservation practitioners in the region who need answers to certain questions in order to do their work for birds. So everyone combined, we came up with some research questions. Why do landowners participate in this program? Do they want to stay in by re-enrolling? And then what happens if they don't stay in? And then what can we do to keep the grassland that's established through CRP on the landscape? It takes a lot of time and money and energy to get those grasslands established. So, how can we prevent them from going right back into crops after the program? So we did a mixed method social science study that included interviews, participant observation, where a researcher is embedded in the field, 3 focus groups, and then also a large mail survey of landowners in the region who were still in the program and others who had come out of the program. And all of that data collection was followed by a series of meetings, both with the folks that we co-developed the study with or co-produced those research questions with, as well as other conservation practitioners that represent the Farm Service Agency, NRCS, and others working with landowners in the region in each of the study states where we were working. So I just want to quickly share 3 results that came out of this study and how those social science insights have resulted in some actionable science, some recommendations that can be implemented. So one insight from combining focus groups and surveys was that landowners are motivated to establish and to keep grasslands on their fields by more than just money. We know economics are a major driver of decisions in this region, but it's more than that too. And also that financial motivations are multifaceted. So even if we want to talk about finances, it's more than just maximizing profits. And so we found through our survey that preventing soil erosion, improving soil health, maximizing profits or financial stability, and improving wildlife habitat were all important reasons for landowners who are currently in the program. For over 75% of them, they said, these are key reasons why I signed up for this. And then also that when we talk about maximizing profits, those CRP payments are more than just profit. For some, it's to survive, to keep their operations afloat. For some, it's to keep that land in their family. And so there are major family motivations at play. And for some, it's actually to retire from farming altogether, to maintain some income from the land while retiring from farming. And then we also found that part about keeping grassland. So when we crossed what landowners did with their land after leaving the program with their motivations for land use, we found that again, that habitat, the soils, also grazing, an interest in maintaining land for grazing were important motivations for keeping grass, even if they couldn't re-enroll in CRP. And so if we take this result, landowners are motivated by more than money, and those financial motivations are multifaceted. Some things that can be done are in program communications and in the design of CRP to really tap into those intrinsic landowner motivations to protect soils and water and habitat. And then another one is to support those grazing related motivations structurally or institutionally through CRP and related programs. So changes to the Farm Bill have simplified this in some ways, allowing landowners to enter other programs in the last year of their CRP contract, for example, and then others allowing grazing to be used in the middle of CRP to manage those grasslands. So supporting grazing related motivations in all of those ways. Sorry. So the second insight, many landowners want to stay in CRP. Others leave due to financial and programmatic limitations. So 83% of folks who are currently in the program wanted to stay. 54 who had exited the program said, I wanted to get back in, I just couldn't. And in terms of those who chose not to re-enroll, these were key reasons: the lower profit potential, the restrictions on haying and grazing that came with program participation, and also just the rules that they felt like they didn't make sense for their local context. So again, taking those results into action, we can incorporate local level and landowner preferences and feedback into CRP design and delivery. And that's another kind of co-production. We can also increase support for sustainable haying and grazing. So getting landowners participating in grazing operations in the middle of their CRP contracts, and then they're set up to keep doing that once their CRP contracts end. And then the third insight is that in spite of landowner interest, the acreage that comes out of CRP is not entering other land conservation programs in this region. So I just want to point out two numbers in these figures. 39% of people who are currently in the program said, yes, I'm interested in enrolling in another conservation program after CRP. But if we look at those who had exited the program, only 5% of them had enrolled in those programs between 1 and 7 years after their CRP contract ended. So what's happening here? Why are so many more interested than are enrolling? And so results to action, we can aid that transition from CRP to other conservation programs, partially by connecting landowners to those other programs that meet their financial needs while keeping those grasslands on the landscape. And then one thing we can do too is more social science. So really explore the reasons for that bottleneck, trying to understand the difficulty of that transition between programs and then address those barriers. So some highlights from this study, things that I think are interesting: the study and the recommendations were co-produced with conservation practitioners from the region and also with landowners through meetings of the soil and water conservation districts. We used multiple social science methods, and that helped us really understand landowners in their own terms, as well as get a broad understanding of landowners in the region. The study led to actionable recommendations, some of which have been implemented. So Bird Conservancy of the Rockies has used this study to justify adding some private lands biologists in some of their areas. And so ultimately, social science insights can be used to make grassland habitat created through CRP more durable. And that's the goal of this study and what we're seeing happening. So that's all I have. This is a paper that we published, and you can find a full study report at that URL.
Great, thanks so much, Jessica. Appreciate you sharing your thoughts on your work there, our work, I should say, in the Great Plains. Next up, we have Liliana Naves, who works at the Division of Subsistence of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game in Anchorage, Alaska. She leads harvest research and coordinates the harvest assessment program of the Alaska Migratory Bird Co-Management Council. She will be speaking with us about the role of social science in the management of subsistence harvest in Alaska. Take it away, Lily.
Thank you, Ashley. Are you seeing my screen there?
Yeah, you're great.
Okay, I'm not seeing the green edge here, but of course something weird would happen. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join this discussion today. I would like to acknowledge Lara Menjak. She works with me in the Bird Subsistence Research Program and the many state, Alaska Native, federal, and other partners that are intrinsic to this story. As a biologist now working in social sciences, I moved from squeezing birds to interviewing people about bird harvesting and what they know about birds. I got involved in social sciences only after I finished my PhD, but bird conservation requires working with people. It's not needed, though, for biologists to largely change career paths or invest lots of time in learning a whole different field of science, or for vice versa, for social sciences to get involved with biology. We can help each other in interdisciplinary collaborations. This was in a community of Savunga in the Bering Sea with Morgan Nojuk. He's a local research assistant. Indigenous people settled in Alaska thousands of years ago, and since then have been harvesting birds and eggs here. In 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act set to restore bird populations depleted by commercial harvest. The treaty was crucial for bird conservation. To protect nesting birds, the treaty set a harvest closure in spring and summer. But this harvest closure brought the most hardship for Alaska Indigenous peoples because the spring bird harvest alleviated hunger and starvation when resources are scarce. It took decades of perseverance by Alaska Native leaders until the treaty was amended in 1997 to recognize legally the spring and summer subsistence bird harvest in Alaska. Despite progress, relationships are still fragile. In 2018, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game formally issued an apology to Alaska Native peoples for unintended harm caused by the spring closure. Lack of harvest and socioeconomic data was one of the reasons for which it took so long to legalize the spring-summer harvest in rural Alaska. Diverse groups opposed the treaty amendment. So information generated by social science research was key to get enough people on board that legalizing harvest in Alaska was not a threat to the bird populations and other user groups along the flyways. At its first meeting in 2000, the Alaska Migratory Bird Co-Management Council started plans for an annual bird harvest survey, which has been ongoing since 2004. Soon after the treaty amendment, the Alaska Migratory Bird Co-Management Council was created to provide a meaningful role for Indigenous peoples in harvest management conservation. The council includes the state, federal, and Alaska Native partners. So the Native partners and the local surveyors play a key role in data collection. The survey samples about 40 communities and 1,000 households across Alaska. Ducks and geese are about 85% of the total subsistence bird harvest, but the species of conservation concern are usually harvested in relatively low numbers, but they drive harvest management. So mixing social sciences and biology, we address priorities for communities and for bird conservation. For example, we combined shore-based bird point counts, harvest surveys, and traditional knowledge key responded interviews to answer questions during the Yellow-billed loon Endangered Species Act listing process. In another project, we surveyed the subsistence users on how they process birds and which parts they consume. We plucked, cut, and weighted birds and parts and gathered data on body mass and distribution ranges for dozens of species. Then we combined ethnographic and biological data to define methods to convert numbers of birds harvested into edible mass or food. And this is part of assessing the socioeconomic importance of bird harvests. In response to shorebird conservation needs, besides harvest quantification, we interviewed Indigenous users to learn about ethnotaxonomy and cultural values related to shorebirds. This information is now being used in a place and culture-based shorebird conservation outreach program in communities and schools in Western Alaska. So in conclusion, this work searches answers to some key questions. What's important for communities? What information is most relevant for conservation and management? And this includes how to effectively include the local and traditional knowledge and research and management. How to meaningfully engage communities from research planning to conservation action. So building relations and coordinating with partners may take time, but in this process, small steps do count and is an effective and meaningful approach. Thank you.
Great, Lily. Thank you so much for your presentation as well. If I could ask the three panelists to come back on the screen and share their video, that would be great. We're now going to have a panel discussion. Brent and I have some questions prepared for you, as well as we're getting some great questions in the Q&A. And I encourage folks who haven't already put questions into the Q&A to do so. I want to start by talking about a question that's very timely for us. So we've been in a time of crisis in the world, dealing with a pandemic. And there's similar times of crisis that occur: war, recessions, wildfire, et cetera. We're working on something like social science research, or the application of social science research, like encouraging people to change behavior, might be considered to be tone deaf. So one of our participants is interested in how you all would suggest navigating those sorts of situations. Do you think it's important to make the work and needs of bird conservation or the work of social science relevant to the time? Or is it something that you pull back on and take a pause on what you're doing? And how do you think about that?
Yeah, I guess, Ashley, that was directed towards me, so I can start. Yeah, I guess I want to start by saying that this isn't, me and a bunch of gringos sitting here in the North America suggesting these changes. Our working group consists of agency and NGO folks in that whole region, and even the hunting federations. And so during COVID, a lot of the, just like in the US, hunting was something people could do to get outside. So there was no breaking like Guadeloupe and Martinique, and so they've actually, in the meantime, just a month ago in Martinique, suggested a set of more restrictive bag limits. And that, again, was by the hunting federation. So this isn't something that's, kind of rolling downhill, so to speak. And, the process in Guyana, we just finished up that study, again, with the local colleagues that I was always saying, if there's any chance, like, you be as safe as you can going to interview people and everything else. And it's all outside. So that was, one good thing. But that's going to take a long time to move that process forward. And maybe, in the times of COVID, as I brought up, is there a need to substitute that nutritional source? That's something we're not sure about. It seems like it's more a commercial thing, but it still could be a source of income for fishermen who may be at that minimum wage level. And this has actually been used to help spoon-billed sandpipers in Myanmar, is to find, alternative sources for the folks there, again, fishing people who are capturing the spoon-billed sandpipers along with other shorebirds. So I don't think we are being tone deaf, because, again, we talked in the last session about stakeholders. We have a good stakeholder group that will certainly, bounce all these ideas off.
Thanks, Brad. Jessica or Lily, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I'll add, I guess, one thing that NABC had a large, in the wake of the 3 Billion Birds campaign, there were some relevancy messages that were developed. And the one that was set to release right at the height of COVID was on economics and the relevance of bird conservation to economics. But we knew that many people were struggling with lost jobs and that there were just bigger issues on their plates. And so NABC did stall the release of that relevancy document and chose instead to release one related to health and mental health, and that birding can be good for you right now when you're stuck at home and you can't do anything else. And so I think, that's not social science per se, but it is communicating the relevance of of the work. And so I think there are ways to be sensitive and to shape that message for the time. And then I guess one other tiny anecdote is just the way that our research agenda changes a little bit based on what key issues are going on right now. There's a lot of work right now on the impact of COVID on birding, and that would have not happened, you know, a year and a half ago. And you see that come with war and recession as well. Certainly issues of diversity and inclusion are hot on research agendas right now as well. So.
Thanks, Jessica. Lily, it looked like you had a comment too.
Yeah, well, last year in 2020, we started preparing for the annual harvest survey of the Alaska Migratory Bird Command Council around August at the year to deploy logistics planning and such. And when we started that, we consulted with partners across the surveyed regions on how they would like to move forward. Would you like then, we set a series of options of alternatives. Should they cancel the survey, would there be an option to do survey with a different data collection system? Would it be acceptable to the local surveyors to just hang the survey package on the doorknobs? And so partners from different regions have different preferences, and but they weighted all the perspectives, and you decided for canceling the survey that year. And this year, COVID is upticking in Alaska again, and we are going to go to the same process again to consult what they think it's a better way to go. And in this between, instead of doing the harvest survey, we worked on other projects that are also of the interesting priorities for the AMBCC.
Thanks, Blake. I have a question for all of you guys. It seems like a lot of the presentations today and the discussion is revolved around incentives, whether they're economic or market-based, all with the end goal of facilitating actionable conservation. And so I guess I'm wondering from a social science perspective, how might we be able to leverage the outcomes of some of the work that you guys have done, whether it's through collaborative conservation or lobbying efforts to create what we view are sustainable solutions that might be buffered against fluctuations in the economy or you know, an impending change in the president or societal values as they shift based on, you know, other things that are going on in the world. You guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess I can start again, Brant, because I noticed there was a question about the harvest and the economic view. And I think, you know, Jessica touched on that too, that maybe understanding, you know, how folks value these resources is really important then on figuring out what that solution is. And, you know, and I know here from, you know, living in the West that there's a lot of, you know, the ranching community that it's really about their, you know, their family and their cultural tradition. And that's got a parallel then, I think, in Guyana, where we were getting told that, you know, it was really a segment of the population of East Indian descent that was really the consumers of shorebirds and would often ask for orders doing holidays, religious holidays. And so and that's why I put at the end there, that's something we really need to pursue, because that could really change, you know, the solution from being just an economic one to the harvesters to thinking about working, you know, on that cultural aspect, again, with this very, you know, identified segment of the population. So I think that's kind of the value. And I think too, for me personally, is like just understanding what the context of these birds are being sold in, because, you know, as the kind of conservationist, there's a lot of reaction to that. It's like, no, that's morally wrong. Well, you know, I would never want to make that statement. And that's why I tried to dig in, and we talk a lot about what the overall economic condition of those people living on the coast of Guyana is, so that we have a more fair, you know, I think, approach to it, and not, again, with this, put the hammer down.
Yeah, there's social science evidence that these financial incentives can actually dampen or sort of drown out these other more inherent motivations that people have to do conservation. So I think it is always understanding what else is at play. How else can you motivate people, even if those financial incentives are either not an option because of shifting politics or shifting, economic conditions. But like Brad said, I think part of the promise of this kind of study that I presented and others is that if you can understand some of those, deeper motivations, why people would put their land in CRP in the first place, you can really tap into those, and that they might be more durable and enduring than, oh, the market tends to be bad right now for corn or cotton, so I'm going to do this CRP thing. And then they may change their mind, but if you can identify landowners and really tap into those other motivations, it may be more durable over time.
Lily, do you have any thoughts you want to share on the topic?
I think that sometimes the economic importance is not upfront. For instance, subsistence harvest of birds in Alaska doesn't involve sale or commercial value, but working with the native communities and the tribes, every time we intend to work with the community, the first step is to a formal process of consulting with the tribal council and to get a formal consent to do that work. And in presenting a project out of the bat, you need to be able to articulate what's in there for them. So I think that's an important part of engaging people in communities since out very the beginning, is to have an idea of how that can benefit them. Not only benefit, how that can harm them too, because sometimes harvest management and other conservation actions may interfere with the activities that are very important for people, and kind of how really to be mindful of what's in there for them and how that can harm them since the beginning. And otherwise we don't have how to start a conversation, even if it's not a perfect understanding of the pros.
Thanks for that, Lily. Yeah. I see there's a few questions coming in specific to Jessica and the Conservation Reserve Program. I think I'm going to hold those and see if we have time for them, or ask her to respond to those in the chat later, since we want to keep the spotlight more broadly on social science per se. They're great questions though, so I just want to let you all know that we're not missing seeing them come in, and they will be addressed. I'll take a step back and think about how we have a lot of folks who work with bird conservation initiatives here and are part of those networks. And they might be interested in trying to incorporate social science aspects into the work of the bird conservation initiative. So how does a bird conservation initiative, whether it be NABC or a specific working group for a specific species, determine what type and which type of social scientists to work with? You all saw my ring earlier today of all the different disciplines that there are in social science. So interested in your thoughts about how initiatives should figure out who are the social scientists you want to engage and how to get them involved.
Well, yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
I was just gonna basically say I don't have a great answer, but it's a chicken and an egg thing. There's also this issue of how early so my instinct is to say, well, it depends on what your questions are. If you want to understand landowner, the way that they think and act, then you probably need a psychologist or someone that understands conservation psychology. If you really want to understand the institutions and how they're shaping the decisions that landowners are making, or the politics, then you need a political scientist or someone who can come at it from that. But it's also great to have social scientists involved from the very beginning when you're deciding what the questions are. And so there's a little bit of a, maybe back and forth. So maybe have your favorite pet social scientist that you go to with questions, and then, engage others as those research questions become apparent that that's what you need expertise in to answer. But I don't have a great question or a great answer, I think.
In some contexts, if it's to work directly with communities, it can be helpful to try to identify someone that already work with those communities and have the relations going. It can be a protected process to get those relations in place. And often there is no roadmap on formal and informal protocols on how to engage with the communities, which are the local associations, what are the protocol to work with tribes and such. So to be, if you're able to connect with someone that is already in that system, can be a big efficiency gain.
Jessica, you mentioned that, you know, obviously getting social scientists involved early and often is the key approach. And I guess the follow-up question I have is it ever too late to try to incorporate social science? Is there a place where there's diminishing returns, or that you're trying to, you know, basically fit a round peg into a square hole, and then you can't resolve the issues at hand because you haven't had them in a co-production based model?
Yeah, I think it's never too late or too early to involve someone. The risk that you run may be, you know, we have all of these answers from the biological science, and we just need you to tell us how to make people do exactly what we want to do based on this information. And so that's probably the risk if you get too far down the line, particularly if you are operating under the premise of co-production, or you want to make it appear that you're engaging the local communities if you haven't actually engaged them along the way. And Ashley mentioned some of this earlier this morning, that when you do stakeholder engagement or community engagement, it's important that they feel like there's actually shaping to be done, that they have some impact on the decisions and the outcomes. So I wouldn't say it's too late. I think particularly, you know, the type of question is just going to change. It may become more of, okay, we have this data, now how do we communicate it? Not, we have this data, how do we make sure that it reflects landowner values, or that we ask the right questions? So I think that, again, the nature of the question may change as you get down the line. Ashley mentioned earlier a document that we put together for the joint ventures too. And one of my favorite parts of that document is that it lists many existing sources of social science information that you can go to without necessarily conducting a whole new social science study. And so sometimes that's very effective too later in the game. So, you know, there's already been all this data collected that says X, Y, or Z about our local communities, the places that we're trying to work. We can integrate that information into our plan or into our conservation strategies. And that could be done later without necessarily needing the time that it takes to conduct a larger social science study.
Yeah, I think, you know, and for what we've done, is I see it just as a scoping, you know, and now we need to really come in and do the real work. It's just, you know, a local person, but this is just like working with landowners. I mean, local folks have a lot of insights, and that's when you start getting a hint of, oh, well, it's this, you know, here's an attitude. Now, can we then develop something and really see, just like any science, right, how widespread representative are these perspectives that your couple local contacts are bringing? So, you know, that's what I'm honored to be on this committee, because I don't think of myself even close to being, you know, a social scientist. But I think why I wanted to do it was to show you can take traditional biology, try to think about it from being around folks like we have on the panel, and just start thinking about it, and then come back and really dig into it. And so, you know, and again, trying to use that open standards thinking of, like, right away, we know that these attitudes, you know, are really what's affecting this issue. So, you know, let's then go try to really figure that out.
A great point, Brad, that it can be an iterative process, and maybe even the open standards approach can help you identify what kind of social scientists you want to be collaborating with based upon the threats that you all are seeing from your applied conservation work on the ground. All right, I want to shift gears a little bit here and talk about from the perspective of being a biologist. So for some of you, it will be easy to wear this hat. And for others, you might be talking from a social scientist perspective. But how can bird conservation professionals or biologists become better collaborators with social scientists? And what sort of opportunities have you all seen, or have you taken advantage of to learn more or understand more about the perspectives of social scientists that you may be working with?
I'll just say one quick thing, then I'll pass it right off. And I think getting involved with your local community, Like, you know, from what you can see, I've operated at national, regional, international scales, but I'm also involved with my local community. And by meeting people that aren't biologists or social scientists or anything gives you a really good perspective. So with our local Audubon group, we developed this idea of how do we become a community asset rather than a bird club. I mean, I just think trying to think about and interact with people at all these different scales and being involved in community gives you that perspective as a biologist for the social piece.
Yeah, I would say we talked in a planning meeting about this word, that it probably comes back to reflexivity and everyone being willing to just step back from your own work a little bit and think, you know, what assumptions am I making about birds in here? And what do I really need to know about people in order to do this work better? Or why do I do this way instead of a different way? I think as we all do that a little bit more, probably Bradley, in our own lives and in our local communities, but also in our professional work, you become more capable of collaborating across those disciplinary lines. You can hear each other better, I think, instead of feeling defensive, maybe, that someone's coming to you with some different idea or way of looking at things. So I think, yeah, just adopting, you know, a habit of reflexivity, thinking about why you do what you do in the way that you do, is probably a good practice for improving your collaborative ability.
Jessica, I think you kind of, oh, go ahead, Lily.
I think that for some people it may come more naturally, but some people may benefit from a little nudging, and the policy can help with that. How we support interdisciplinary collaborations and how we can get people to connect. I think that maybe Ashley, if you could talk a little bit about the AOS efforts in that way.
Sure, Lily's calling on the moderator, but I'm happy to talk a little bit about that, and Jessica and Lily can jump into one of the papers that I shared a link to earlier, and we can send out through the chat pod, was a reflection on how the American Ornithological Society and ornithological societies broadly, and you could probably also extend that to bird conservation initiatives, can integrate social science more. And Lily and her colleague Jackie Keating put together a session at AOS a couple of years ago, which then led to conversations with the journal editor for the past Condor current ornithological applications. And we're happy that there's now a social science initiative through that journal. And I'm now an associate editor with that journal. And we fortunately have an upcoming special issue that's related to ethno-ornithology. And we're trying to encourage more social science contributions there, as well as trying to think about other ways that we can incorporate social science more into that work of that society, ensuring that there's panels at the conference that relate to the social science or symposium. And certainly the conference's theme this year with a focus on diversity of people and the large flock of bird conservation or bird ornithology that we all are part of is a great human dimensions focus. So that's a little bit of how we've tried to foster that work, thinking about it not just from working on the bird conservation initiatives, but also thinking about working on from the Ornithological Society perspective of social science integration. Jessica or Lily, do you have anything to add to that?
Thank you.
That was great.
I just want to dig into this question a little bit more. You know, we all know the collaboration within a discipline can be challenging. And so across disciplines, then there's additional challenges. And I guess, you know, you talked a little bit about reflexivity and about understanding the perspective of the other collaborator. I'm wondering if you guys could speak at all to challenges that you may have faced in terms of working with, you know, somebody who's dead set on the quantitative element of a question and maybe less interested in the social science. And then are there ways to overcome those challenges to ensure, you know, that we ultimately all have the same mutual goals, but, you know, if we're proselytizing a model where we're putting social science out there and we want, you know, for example, somebody who's focused on the biological elements of bird conservation to work with somebody focused on the social elements, there's going to be a rub sometimes. And I'm wondering if you guys can speak to that at all.
I'm going to jump in with a teachable moment. Social science is quantitative as well. And there's qualitative social science and there's quantitative social science. And I think this is like a great example of how we make assumptions about others' fields. I know I say this say the wrong things all the time related to ornithological work as well. And I think it's great to like have those chances to have dialogue and say, hey, wait, did you know that social science is quantitative too? So with that, I will step back and not say anything else if you all can answer the actual question.
I can provide some examples. So I was highly interdisciplinary and still am as a graduate student, and worked on lots of teams with economists and geneticists and entomologists, and often was the social scientist in the room, but then also with political scientists, which was slightly different. And often like the term efficiency means something very different in ecology and economics and in political science, and in the way that maybe you would use it just in lay terms. And so I think acknowledging that upfront, we're probably going to use the same word to mean different things, and we may have to just address that and decide what frame of reference we're coming at it from, or that we're going to define our words carefully upfront is one way. Just one example of it creates problems in the way that you write together or think about problems together, but it can be addressed, like Ashley said, if you're teachable and willing to do that. And I guess the other thing I would say, like Ashley was mentioning, there are often differences between social scientists and economists want to come at things very quantitatively. And I love telling stories and using like the words of the people that we're trying to understand. So I know that we have seen like in this FSA project that the focus groups and interviews ended up being really compelling for the economists that we work with. That, oh, listen to like the rich story that's coming out of this approach to social science, not just sending people a survey and analyzing their data without ever, looking at their faces. So I think sometimes it can just be, letting the work speak for itself, which doesn't address, how you formulate the research question in the first place or how you agree upon methods. But if you can, demonstrate that this works and this provides really useful insight, that helps too. There can be a conversion process on all sides.
All right, if there's no further thoughts on that, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap up here and thank our social science panelists for the excellent insights and ideas and thoughts that you all shared with us here today. It was a great conversation. Reminder to check out the Q&A and see if there's any other questions that come in that you can answer within there. And we really appreciate you all joining us. So virtual round of applause for you. And then I'm going to ask the communications panel folks to come in and join us, and we can get started here in just a minute or two. If anyone wants to stretch, now's a good time. All right, it's about the top of the hour here. So we have a communications panel that's going to be joining us here this afternoon. If I can ask Miyoko and Megan and Hannah to turn on your videos, we'll get ready to get started here. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us for the social science panel. Now we're going to talk about the last of the three main components that were discussed this morning as an important part of considering as we think about conservation as a human endeavor. So this morning I talked about how there's an important role for external and internal communications in improving the conservation efforts that we're all a part of related to bird conservation. I alluded to the strong existing networks of communications professionals and their impressive communications planning and implementation efforts and the various tools that they've developed. So our final panel this afternoon is going to bring together some of the best examples of these efforts with communications professionals representing a joint venture, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a university. They have led impressive partnership efforts, bringing together communications professionals and biologists and even social scientists across the flyway, across large regions, and across nations. And they're going to share their experiences with these efforts and insights on how to advance the communication efforts of bird conservation initiatives. So first up today is Megan Racy, and Megan works with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, North Atlantic Appalachian region. She is currently the acting chief of staff for the region, and she's going to be discussing her work from her previous role in external affairs, where she helped lead a team that worked on the Piping Plover Strategic Communications Plan. Take it away, Megan. Your screen is perfectly shared.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. And as Ashley noted, I'll be talking about using communications to help conservation of the Atlantic coast piping plover. For folks that joined Ashley's talk about reducing disturbance, it may help to know that this was a precursor to that work. So one of the triggers for this journey for us was a perception that plovers were getting a lot of bad press, impacting their conservation and draining our time. We wanted to look into this and potentially address it. Additionally, we recognized that there was a particularly challenging aspect of plover recovery addressing disturbance by beachgoers. Yet we didn't have a guide for informing and interacting with beachgoers. So we got a team together, mixing biologists, communicators, and interpreters. And with the help of a strategic communications consultant, we used a planning model called RACES that you'll see here to begin our work together. We started with a literature review on related outreach, a survey on the conservation community to understand their perceived needs, and that analysis of plover media coverage. Here's just a snapshot of just some of the findings through that work that influenced our next step of action planning, including the helpful finding that most news coverage around piping plovers is actually positive or neutral, which suggested we could put a lot of our energy into focusing on other kinds of communication channels. So for action planning, we agreed on the issue, on our goal. We identified and prioritized audiences and behaviors that we were looking for. We spent a lot of time thoughtfully developing messages, overall messages, general messages, as well as messages specific to audiences, including an important aspect of messaging, which is recognizing how far we've come in plover recovery and that we have a goal that we're looking to get to. Then we used the enable, engage, exemplify, and encourage approach to develop an entire suite of strategies and tactics for folks to consider. So for example, we're talking about things like enabling audiences by providing clear, consistent, and ideally positive information on needed behaviors, both in person and online from trusted sources, and removing barriers to those behaviors. For engaging audiences, things like providing opportunities for education and involvement in plover conservation. As an example there, we're talking about field visits for news media, for elected officials, that sort of thing. For exemplify, we're talking about trying to demonstrate positive attitudes and behaviors. How can we show folks what we're looking for? And then encouraging audiences by providing updates on progress, like that messaging I showed earlier, rewards for behaviors, online, third-party, and in-person communication. So recognizing essentially those champions, but also enforcing rules and regulations. So what we ended up with was a really carefully designed menu of content, strategies, and actions that could be applied at various levels. In particular, we felt like this work could be carried forward to inform campaigns and programs at the local, state, and regional level. However, we did see the chance to continue striving for that consistency, as I showed earlier in my slides, at a number of levels. So I wanted to just briefly touch on a few things that we worked on as a group as well. One was signage, engaging, informative signs that are now visible at sites up and down the Atlantic coast. This is a great example of how our team, thanks to one of our team members, Steph Reynolds, found synergy with the Atlantic Flyway Shorebird initiative. Our messaging informed their work to design and produce these signs. We did want to create also a strategy too, talking about where do you put the signs, how do you pair them with regulatory signs, but we have not had a chance to do that. Another collaboration with AFC was the effort to collect and provide partners with existing outreach resources. People are really doing incredible things up and down the range for this species. And we wanted the opportunity for them to contribute those excellent resources to one another. I also want to do just a quick shout out here to check out on their website the Share the Shore section, which has some amazing new animated videos that you can use as well for your purposes. We also thought it would be important to improve online information for beachgoers, basically the places that people are checking before they go to the beach. We haven't found a way to really do this at a larger scale though, but feel like it is something that is important to continue to consider and see if we can get the resources to address. We recommended supporting and evaluating community involvement programs like the Be a Good Egg and Share the Shore. At the time, actually Virginia Tech was doing a review on the Be a Good Egg program that has led to some improvements. And of course, AFC has enlisted Virginia Tech's help in working on the human disturbance best management practices and in piloting social marketing campaigns to reduce disturbance. We also developed a social media strategy with the idea of collecting or giving folks guidance on what they could do throughout the season and the year to share how plovers are doing, follow individual families, and we just create graphics periodically like the one here just to try to optimize on current trends. We did have a number of evaluative strategies like surveying our target users of the plan, to gather stewardship indicators while collecting plover data and coordinating with AFC on their evaluative efforts. We haven't been able to undertake much of this due to capacity and resources, but what I'm really excited about is that many of you will probably recognize a ton of the names here because our folks, while we're not working specifically on this under this umbrella, folks are involved in efforts at their own sites or under umbrellas like AFC, and we continue to hear that this is a really important foundational resource for folks. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Megan. That's a great example of how and why conservation work shouldn't stop at just the science and management, and that this dissemination piece to broad audiences is equally, if not more important in so many instances. So I appreciate that. Our next speaker is Miyoko Chu, and she is the Senior Director of Communications at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Today, Miyoko is going to be talking to us about how scientists and communicators can collaborate from the outset using a co-production model on news and social media campaigns, from the concept of planning to issue framing to storytelling, and then connecting that information out with broader audiences. She's going to use the 3 Billion Birds campaign as an example. So Miyoko, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Brent. And is the first slide showing now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, first, Megan, that was such an inspiring and strategic example. Thanks so much for sharing that. And I'm going to talk now about how communications came together in a different example for the 3 Billion Birds mass media campaign. And you'll hear an echo of some of the same elements that Megan highlighted, especially how you can maximize the impact of your work, like the number of people who will see and understand it, and perhaps even take action by, bringing together scientists and other experts, communicators, partners, and stakeholders early and often, from conceptualizing and planning a campaign to collaborating on how to frame the issues, creating the content, and then ultimately telling that story and keeping the momentum going. Often we communicators begin planning media outreach when outcomes are known or when a scientific paper has been accepted. But in this case, scientists reached out to the communicators when their manuscript was still in progress. And that was more than a year before it was published. Now, this early collaboration proved to be pivotal for the impact of the campaign. It enabled us to work as a team across the organizations of the co-authors of the paper, as well as additional partners. And it takes time, as you know, to work with partners. And so the sooner you come together, the more co-ownership there can be, and the more everyone can benefit from each other's strengths. And that's what we saw in this case, with scientists and communicators from multiple organizations in the room. We could co-develop all the messaging to ensure accuracy as well as relevance. And it was in these conversations together that we developed the communication strategy, we discussed the visuals, we chose the so-called poster species and agreed upon which ones to showcase declines as well as successes. And it's where we debated everything from specific words like 1 in 4 or 29% or 3 billion birds lost, or larger issues like how do we talk about birds as sentinels of the planet's health, or how do we talk about the value of birds in their own right. And because multiple partners participated, we could ultimately present a unified voice and a more powerful suite of storytelling assets than any one organization could have done. And communicators may get the attention for press outreach initially, but it's ultimately the experts who tell the story. And I chose this photo because I was just looking for an image of one of our scientists on camera. But it reminded me of something important about this type of collaboration, which was that from the very beginning, Pete Mara had talked with us about messaging about values of birds in their own right. And here you can see that, in a 2-minute news segment where you get maybe 15 seconds as a scientist, this is the soundbite that CBS chose to feature. And he mentioned when we lose birds, it's like tearing down our museums, we're losing our heritage. And in that moment, it was a punch to the gut. You could see it on the face of the newscaster when they cut away. So this type of thing really works when scientists are in the room to help shape the messaging that is authentic to them. And because all the co-authors were involved in the messaging and we all worked from the same talking points, we were able to field dozens and dozens of interviews by many of the scientists on this project in just a few days, all reinforcing one another's messages. This led to more than 1,000 media hits, reaching a circulation of 2.3 billion. And because we had all planned how to coordinate and follow up and were prepared with a follow-up social media action campaign, we were able to generate an additional 3.2 million impressions towards these actions, including videos that went with each one. We incorporated the messaging into the State of the Birds report and brought the expertise of multiple partners to legislative briefings. So in all, out of more than 14 million research outputs that Altmetric has ever tracked, the science paper ranked number 209 for the quantity and quality of online coverage. That's in the top 0.001%. And this paper inspired not only the widespread public knowledge of declines of North American birds, but also sparked new coordinated concepts and initiatives in the bird conservation community and beyond, including the Road to Recovery effort that we're immersed in today. And it's our hope that all of this leads to heightened action for birds. And it began by ensuring that scientists, communicators, and partners were in the room together, again, early and often throughout the whole process, including up to this very moment.
Great, thanks so much, Miyoko, for sharing that fantastic example of just a really broad impact that a communications effort can have. And I really like your emphasis on how that was possible because you all started your collaboration so early on in the process. So thank you. look forward to continuing to discuss your insights on that as part of the panel discussion. We're going to transition now to Hannah Nicknow, and Hannah is joining us from the Intermountain West joint venture. Hannah is the communications and marketing coordinator for the joint venture. She's going to be speaking about SageWest, which is a network of nearly 600 members that focuses on advancing communication and encouraging outreach activities that support collaborative conservation across the sagebrush ecosystem. Looks great, Hannah. You're ready to roll.
Thanks, Ashley. And it's just so fascinating to kind of have these kind of two previous discussions and examples beforehand of really savvy, intelligent, just beautiful campaigns that have such impact. And my hope is that kind of what I tell you about SageWest continues to grow, and you know, we can learn from those. So SageWest was founded in 2016 by a group of communication professionals as well as leadership representatives within the Western United States, around and immediately following the no-list decision for the greater sage grouse. The concern at the time was that, you know, there was a ton of collaborative effort and relationship building and trust that was created around the sage grouse plans and that no-list decision, and there was concern that that would be lost, or it would kind of slowly disintegrate as time went on. So SageWest was founded as a way to try to keep the momentum and those relationships that came about around this bird. And so it was just a couple of, you know, probably 24 leadership representatives from all sorts of federal, state, and NGO, as well as tribes, and as well as for-profit entities that kind of came together with their leaderships and their communication staff to talk about how do we do that. And so SageWest was what was created, and it was, you know, all around the greater sage grouse, but it grew to talk more about the sagebrush system and how can we keep good conservation momentum for this species, but also the habitat as a whole. And so kind of we created this unifying vision, a sagebrush country that is sustainably managed and restored in a balanced, collaborative manner for the benefit of people and wildlife. So kind of we chose to do that through strategic communications that continued those relationships that were all kind of brought to a head with this species and that no-list decision. And so we you know, wanted to keep talking about that bird, and the sage grouse is still so much the foundation of this communications network. But we really, it's that kind of that system as a whole to keep those stakeholders at the table, to keep everyone talking together, and as well as to try to amplify our kind of the things happening in the communications realms, as well as the science and the boots on the ground conservation that's happening across this broad landscape. So you know, the participation in this network, which really is founded within a listserv. So it's a listserv of almost 500 individuals, but everyone is there. Everyone is engaging through this kind of internal and external network in voluntary participations. There is no funding behind the SageWest Communications Network. So we work towards kind of that internal communication that happens through a listserv, but as well as that kind of external, where we can broaden awareness on conservation issues within this ecosystem. So kind of that listserv is what keeps us all together. But the reason the whole network is able to function is because it is neutral. It is bipartisan. We have a list of engagement roles to participate in the network that does not allow for advocacy. We do not talk about policy. And so it's very much a safe space where these 584 participants representing 171 organizations feel safe to share their information, to kind of push out new communication products or bodies of science. We do allow some job posting to go through this network as long as it is focused on finding good people to work in this ecosystem and the kind of around the sage grouse, as well as the 350 other species that depend on that landscape. So kind of that keeping a lot of people together has been a delicate dance that we've played, but kind of through a strong list of rules and how people engage through this network, it's continued to work, years later. And so the tools and ways in which we do communication through this network, through this listserv, is everyone's information is shared throughout the listserv on a monthly basis. We have a number of people who are on a technical team that help facilitate the network. So my collaborator, Dolly Edmonds with Audubon Rockies, is a huge important player in this network. So she keeps everyone's contact so that anyone who wants to participate in the network knows exactly who is there, how to contact them, and that further facilitates those relationship building projects. So we also have communicator workshops where we bring the communications professionals together to work on technical skill development, to share projects that they're working on, to get support in collaborative communication efforts, be it a video, a social media campaign. We have a newsletter where we all feed information out to it to try to elevate our communication products beyond just kind of our small individual reaches. We can amplify it throughout this large group. Field tours are something we're really hoping this September, maybe a couple of us can get back into the field under a SageWest umbrella in the form of field tours. We also help support journalist workshops, getting groups of media out into the field to talk to experts from across the SageWest network about what they are seeing, what they are experiencing, kind of the work they are doing in the sagebrush sea. And then we've also been able to be incorporated into a number of science strategies, into a number of conservation strategies, like the two other communications presentations you've heard. It's the bringing in of the communicators very early to these efforts to help amplify and make sure that science is reaching, and those conservation strategies are reaching the people that really need to be hearing that information and helping implement that science and those management that's being kind of discussed across this system. And so kind of the challenge though that we have with this model is that it is the challenge, and the beauty of it is owned by no one. There is no funding that goes behind this network. It is all in-kind services of staff time that organizations have allocated to their communications employees to dedicate to this effort. So that has been fantastic because it is, a ground swelling effort of pure voluntary engagement that has been extremely successful. The sagebrush sea, the West, kind of, bird conservation across the world, it's changing. And so our model is open to change, is open to adapting. So we are currently looking forward. We want, we want feedback on how this is working and what's being learned, new ways to approach. So we're always willing to try something new, but kind of there's a bit of an identity that SageWest has in that everyone owns it with kind of the voluntary efforts that they put into it. And so, we want communications professionals to be engaged early and often. We want kind of the best of the science, of the technical transfer, of the stories, of the speakers. Kind of this network is there to elevate that. And then we're always open to trying new things. So this is a model that we have done for sagebrush conservation and sage-grouse conservation communications that we want others to learn from. We want to see maybe this model taken and adapted for other species, for other habitats. And so we're really excited to continue to grow this and learn from the very savvy communicators that we have here and that are, you know, participating in this network. And so I look forward to questions, and I'll stop there with my slides.
Great, Hannah, thanks so much. Excellent to see what you all have accomplished with this network and to really learn about the principles and approach behind the network that you've been involved in. Looks like we might have actually lost Hannah for a moment there, but I assume, oh, there she is, popping back in. All right, so it's now Q&A time. We've gotten some great questions coming in through the Q&A, as well as Brant and I have some for you. I want to start with one of the questions that we received from a panelist. I think maybe some of you all have insights on them. And this attendee raised the question that sometimes organizations try to avoid communicating about any sort of polarizing issues that might reduce negative press or backlash. And this participant's interested in what sort of ways can we address these polarizing issues, maybe if there's inaccurate information out there, and are there successes for addressing this while trying to minimize any negative press that you might get in the process?
I can start. Thanks, Ashley, and thanks to the person who presented that question. With the piping plover work, we've dealt frequently with predator management backlash. So managing predators of shorebirds to help the shorebirds recover, essentially. And we have had a lot of conversations around how to deal with misinformation related to that. And there's been a lot of work to try to equip folks with information and guidance on how to minimize that backlash. And I could share just a few ideas and recommendations that we've had in the past related to that, this example of predator management. It felt like for many years, folks didn't want to talk about it at all, and not talking about it proactively also meant not preparing to be reactive. And so that was really a challenge. When something would happen, folks weren't prepared necessarily to respond to that at an appropriate, in a quick manner, essentially. So, you know, the first thing I always say is, even if you're not able to convince folks that you should be proactive with your communications, that being prepared to react is really important. And spending a lot of time working with the communication folks and leadership and your scientists, having folks at the table to figure out how to most effectively communicate that information. There is a model out there called the Bleecker Life Preserver model, which it gives you kind of three or four elements to hit on. First, that there is an issue that needs to be addressed. There's a problem that needs to be addressed, and that we're the right people to address it. In fact, it would be irresponsible if we didn't do something about what's happening, in this case, what's happening to these threatened species. And then the approach we are using is reasonable, sensible, responsible, and why. So in this situation, providing the science and helping people understand the professionals, what they're doing is scientifically appropriate, it is humane, and why it's needed. And of course, using multimedia, if you can, to explain through imagery and through graphics what's happening, what's really happening, and what, if we look, for example, for photos of predators with birds, with nests, looking for, trying to help people understand, there's really 300 of these birds. There's one of these birds for every 6,000 gulls you see, or I don't have the numbers right off the top of my head, but just trying to help people understand and put in context what we're really talking about, and being very coordinated in that preparation with partners so that you have multiple voices to balance out that misinformation. So you've got messages that multiple folks have across organizations that they can use and echo this messaging, and then paying really close attention to social media, to be responsive, to monitor social media, to be responsive to that information on a very regular basis. So those are just a few things that I would suggest just from the Plover example. Of course, it's always ideal when you can engage stakeholders in the decision-making process, sort of separate from just the communication side, but those are just some of the communication recommendations.
And Megan, that was really helpful. And I'll just add one small thing that we've learned the hard way, which is that for many of these polarizing issues, it can be because it's seen as political. And so when we put something out, sometimes we don't even recognize ourselves that there's a word that's political enough that someone stops listening to us immediately. And so you see that on social media, monitoring that, you'll know instantly when you've gone in that direction. And so we try to, vet the language with people who do have an opposing view or who might be sensitive to that language. And we found that that helps leave a little bit more of an opening for dialogue than if we're not sensitive to that.
Yeah, and in that SageWest is comprised of so many organizations, many of which are in specific conflict with each other at times, be it litigation or kind of their political views. With that network, in that we have so many diverse perspectives there, we don't touch the hard stuff. Kind of drown them with conservation success is sometimes our approach, but they're kind of the individuals, whether they're NGOs, they can choose to take on those fights, but with that very collaborative nature, we don't go there, and that has been part of the success of it. So we're glad that there are others who will.
I want to just ask a follow-up that also comes from participant. They say misinformation and environmental literacy can be difficult obstacles to community engagement, especially in places where there may be low environmental consciousness or understanding of the issues. And so there may be an environmental justice element to some of our conservation messaging. And I guess the question that the participant is asking is, in your experience, how can we use the communication strategies to distill the messaging down, or what might be some examples that can help overcome that obstacle in terms of the communication approach?
One example that I've heard my colleagues mention is that children are often a wonderful route to connect with the community and to inspire their parents, their older siblings, their communities. And so I've heard examples where there may be an endangered species within a community. I'm thinking of the Philippine eagle, for example, or there's some birds in the Caribbean, where there were efforts to elevate pride around those species and celebrate them and have the community understand how they were not only locally beloved, but globally valuable and beloved as well. And I did see, there's in the question that it can be expensive and time consuming to try to engage, but maybe that's just a part of the investment that we have to make, including in those types of efforts with children within communities.
Any other thoughts, Megan or Hannah, or should I move on?
I think that's a great example of an approach to use is connecting with children, connecting with students, trying to get into families that way and creating the pride. I think I've seen folks do that with plovers as well, trying to engage in New England states, for example, trying to build relationships with individuals who are what's the word I'm looking for? They're members of the community with broad reach and influence, or groups of folks who have a way of reaching a lot more folks in a productive way with messaging and information than we can as a government agency. So that might be another way to think about this is who could you tap into and who can you kind of influence to at least become neutral or maybe even positive, proactive to your messaging that can then be able to help you as an advocate, or at least even if not an advocate, be able to communicate the accurate information to people around them.
Thanks for your thoughts on that. I think those are some great strategies. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and dig a little bit more into something that several of you mentioned, and that's thinking about whether or not your efforts in communications are effective. And how do you evaluate when you're doing broad scale campaigns like you're talking about with the Plover, or Miyoko with the 3 Billion Birds campaign, or Hannah with some of the work that specific organizations or that you might be doing with the joint venture related to Sage Communications are undertaken. And maybe I'll add to that, since Megan suggested that resources might be a limitation there. What are you doing currently, as well as what would you do if resources were no obstacle in order to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of this work?
I'll speak to, there are some collaborative social media based campaigns that SageWest has done, and in that we're creating content together, but they're connected through all our organizations. The quantitative analytics that we can pull from websites, newsletters, social media. There's only so much that your one organization can see, but if you have 20 groups kind of looking at the back end of theirs, and we have just pretty simple spreadsheets where we are calculating our impact. And then when you have 20 organizations working together to just plug in what they can see, and as well as those anecdotal information of, I was, at the University of Colorado, and this, SageWest is now an example in their curriculum. And those kind of anecdotal pieces are always the gold and the money, and those stories that we retell in after action reviews of our communication kind of collaborative efforts. But kind of when you just have a couple people that can pull those numbers, it's really cool to see that impact, but also to use those reports to document those interpersonal connections that those efforts, that's what, fills my cup.
Megan or Miyoko, if resources were no limit, what would you be doing for evaluation of your efforts? Thanks, Hannah, for your thoughts.
Sure, I can say a few things. So I think there are a number of ways to look at outcomes and progress towards our goals. So one way is thinking about internally understanding the target users of the tools. So in this case, we provided a lot of content for our own colleagues in the conservation community to use. So trying to get an understanding from them, how useful are the tools? What else do you need? What kinds of information? So trying to use some measures to understand, is it being useful for them? Is it meeting the needs that you want it to meet? That's initially a step that we wanted to do. And then also looking at, as I mentioned, the stewardship indicators. So understanding when our folks are on the beach, when our partners or our staff and our agency are on the beach collecting data about the birds, to also collect data about the people and what they're doing on the beach. And so trying to understand what is with the human disturbance, trying to get a better sense of what's happening there and be able to tie that to places where we are and are not implementing some of these measures and developing some of, I think as Ashley had talked about before, some of these social marketing efforts so that we can actually have discrete campaigns that we can actually spend time getting input and feedback on and results from having targeted efforts that result, and use some of the information we created at kind of at that broad regional level to inform what's actually going to be tried at various local levels or state levels at specific sites. So that was another thing that we were interested in doing. And then of course, monitoring media, monitoring how many congressional letters are we getting or requests for meetings because there's frustrations about something related to plover protections. So sometimes being the actual quiet is a great thing and an indicator that things are going well, because we aren't getting those calls, we aren't getting as many questions, we aren't getting as many surprise phone calls from reporters or stakeholders, that instead we've actually enough of the right folks in those right meeting in this situation, these specific folks that we're talking about, the elected officials or the news reporters, have a basic understanding of what we're trying to do and why, enough to communicate it to their own constituents or in their own stories. So that's just another way that I look at effectiveness.
Thanks, Megan. Some great additional ideas there to think not only about traditional metrics, but also looking at the people who are the users of the tools you're creating, et cetera. Brant, do you have a question you want to ask next?
Yeah, I do. I mean, you guys have provided some amazing examples of how you guys have effectively used communication and messaging to educate, both internal and external partners. And I guess, I'll just bring it quickly back to Road to Recovery. A lot of the organizing committee talked about this workshop as an information gathering session for us to learn, for the committee to learn, to create this adaptive and flexible process. And I guess the question I have is, what advice would you give Road to Recovery about how we might maximize our impact for efforts towards species recovery or towards trying to create buy-in towards a new paradigm or reimagining of bird conservation? Do you guys have advice for us specifically about what we should and shouldn't do, maybe lessons learned from your efforts?
Well, I'll just mention one forward-looking possibility, which is, there hasn't been a State of the Birds report for a little while now, and so there's just starting to be talked about how can we focus the next one. And I feel that the Road to Recovery workshops, the concepts, the coalitions that have evolved around the Bird Friendly Coalition, around grasslands, and our community's sense of purpose is an opportunity to integrate some of these ideas into the next State of the Birds report. How can we include relevancy in ways that we have been different before? And I'll mention that traditionally we've really thought about science and communications, but we've had one conversation now with social scientists, and we need to have more to understand the opportunity there with State of the Birds report. What about the policy side? How can we be more effective getting into the policy angle of things? And how can we be more inclusive in our messaging to people beyond the choirs? So I think there's a lot of potential to maybe use that as a case example to put some of these ideas into practice.
Megan or Hannah, any thoughts?
I'm good.
Miyoko covered it.
All right, Miyoko's got the proposed plan there that we'll have to keep talking about Thursday when we come back to the last hour of the session about next steps for the Road to Recovery effort. All right, I want to ask you all a question about folks who might be interested in working more with communications professionals or bringing communications professionals to be involved in some of the species working groups efforts, et cetera. How do you all suggest identifying communications professionals and determining what sort of communications professionals to work with?
That's a great question. We're fortunate in our agency to have a communications department. So you sort of know who to start with, and then those folks will engage in conversations to understand, what's the need here? Can we actually, is this something that we can handle in-house? Do we have the right expertise to support you, or can we provide some advice on bringing in external expertise, whether it's developing multimedia materials or a consultant to help with the planning process. So in my sense, that's sort of the initial stepping stone, is just asking if you're lucky enough to have somebody in your organization, or even if they're not focused on your topic areas, starting there and getting some advice from that person, and then talking to other organizations, because they tend to have communications professionals, or they know of folks where you can start that conversation of like, here's what we're, or as early as possible, here's what we're trying to do. Here are the issues that we're trying to address. Here's where we think there might be opportunities to do some communications work. But just having those folks at the table early on, it gives them the chance to provide you with their different perspective, their expertise, and just being able to let them in the door just a little earlier than maybe I feel like we traditionally were brought in towards the end of a process, and at the end when there would be a product to maybe advertise or market or do something around. But being able to bring folks in early and just sort of asking questions and trying to find the right members for your team, and then a process for that. So if there's a communications person and you are meeting weekly with your team, understanding that, okay, the communications person maybe joins once a month, maybe joins, you just sort of have to figure out what makes sense for your specific need. And do you need multiple communication specialists? How frequently do they need to be involved, and that sort of thing. So to me, it really seems to be something that we have to kind of feel out as we go.
A lot of organizations have the structure of a communications director, and then go down kind of through their states or regional levels to kind of figure that out. There's a lot of change, speaking from my experience with federal agencies out west. There's a ton of turnover, and so it can be pretty frustrating to figure out who is where. So that there are a lot of networks like SageWest. We have like a sub listserv of just the people with communication in their titles that certain messages can be sent out to. Or to answer another question I saw, there is an advisors group that represents like the senior level leaderships that help with those decision makings, and then the technical team that are, the back end of a listserv, or like me doing presentations like this. So each of these groups have these sub levels, and so we're not a very big community as far as communications. We often know each other, especially if it's out west in the sagebrush, or if it's kind of shorebird world, we often know who's out there. So I think, throwing a rock and hoping, getting it into the ear of someone, we are hungry for this type of engagement. And so I was recently approached to work on an invasive annual grass data set and the communication of when this data set. And it's like, they brought me in really early, but I have a really good understanding of what they want to do with it now. So let your communicator figure out, like Megan said, the frequency in which they need to be engaged. But when you come at us early, we're just like, oh, we're happy.
So hopefully everybody in the audience is hearing loud and clear the tips to engage them early and have a collaborative conversation about what are your needs and how communications professionals can best work with you. Miyoko, do you have any additional tips?
I thought those were all great points. And I would just add that, so if there is a partner, reach out, because that can be a less expensive and very fruitful way to work. If you don't have those connections, you could consider a consultant who works within the space. And I thought, just for fun, I'd mention two kinds of examples that we've engaged an actual firm to help. One was with a Lights Out campaign, where we wanted to focus on Texas and had no expertise there. So if you don't have expertise in an area, you can go to a firm that does have regional expertise or subject matter expertise. And the other thing, just for fun, is part of the 3 billion bird story. We knew there was a gap in terms of the visibility we wanted. And so we ended up working with a firm that had come up with the Got Milk campaign. And we said, can you do Got Milk for birds? And they actually worked with us to come up with the campaign concept and some graphics.
Nice, thanks for sharing those insights on how you can work with consulting firms too. Brian, I'll turn it over to you for another question.
Yeah, I mean, you guys have given us, it's so eye-opening, and you guys have given us these great examples of communication success stories. And I think scientists in particular oftentimes get a bad rap. I know at Bird Conservancy they do, for being not effective communicators. And I guess I'm wondering, with the scientists you've worked with, did they approach you? Did you guys approach them? Is there a message for the audience about about science communication writ large, or about how we train scientists and how scientists should engage or become better communicators. I mean, I know that we encourage our scientists here to develop marketing and publicity plans and know who the audience is in advance and think about these things at the outset of projects. And I'm just wondering, how would you guys suggest we institutionalize that in the scientific process to ensure that things don't just hit a wall?
Yeah, I'll admit that in the example I was working with, it felt like I was being brought in more at there's a problem that we need communication folks to come in and help us with. So at that point, there'd been that concern, as I said, about a negative news media attention, like, oh, we're getting all of this. Now we need the communications people to come in. And of course, people had been working on communications before that. And of course, a lot of folks have been working very much so at a local and state and other levels on communication issues. But as an individual, that seems sort of like my entry point was, oh, there's an issue. Let's bring the communications person in now. But I think that what folks have been saying about understanding the process to addressing the problem and reaching the goal, and to really think holistically about that and incorporating. So, to think about that, we had a recovery plan for our species that didn't really provide people with the resources to interact with people on the beach to reduce disturbance from people on the beach to the birds. And so, just being able to, as we think about what are the steps and the things we have to address along the way to reach our goals, incorporating those people elements into it. And the people elements naturally bring the other kinds of expertise to the table, like the social scientists, the communication professionals, and those folks are enlisted then to address those problems or those opportunities. So in what you were saying about, we've got something we want to release or announce or an event, and bringing in those folks at that point where you're doing your planning is when I would say to tap into those communication folks.
And then, Miyoko, does either of you have anything you want to add, or should we move on to a different question?
I could just put in a word of encouragement for, those of you scientists who are maybe interested in helping a communication effort move forward, but you're not sure where to start, or you haven't done it before. There's, I guess, two approaches. One is your institution can often offer you media training or can work with you one-on-one if you have an idea for an op-ed or you have some story you want to tell. You can get coaching directly, and you can get a deliverable at the end of the day too, which is really nice. And speaking of op-eds, it's important to know that there's a lot of different ways to contribute to communications. I mean, not everybody can be like Pete and go on CBS and feel perfectly comfortable in that spotlight. But like I said, you can write an op-ed, you can give a lecture that's prepared in advance. You can work behind the scenes with your communicators to put together a campaign. So many, many ways to get involved. But just what I find helpful as a communicator is when any of our scientists signals an interest. They just raise their hand and they say, I want to get involved. And then, yeah, that's the starting point.
So I see that you all are approachable, and certainly getting that across. So hopefully everyone's aware of that. And even if we don't share Miyoko's, Hannah's, and Megan's email addresses specifically, hopefully it's encouragement to reach out to conservation professionals working in the communications realm who might be working on a topic you're interested in. I think one of the last questions that I want to make sure that we hit on here is building, not only bringing in individual scientists, but building a communications network of individuals. So Hannah's SageWest example was a really large scale version of that. Miyoko, you've had the network of folks working together on 3 billion birds. Megan, you had the network of folks working together on piping plover communications. Can you elaborate a little bit more about how you make those collaborative communication networks work well, and any sort of like key tip or lesson learned that you'd want to share with the audience here today. Hannah's certainly emphasized the let's try to put aside our political differences, but are there other tips to make sure that those succeed?
Yeah, we have some organizational structures that have worked really well for us, and we borrowed this kind of format from the bi-state working group. So that was for the bi-state subpopulation of sage grouse on the California-Nevada border. And they had an advisory group and they had a technical team. And so together, the advisory group were, you know, the director of Nevada Division of Wildlife Resources and the regional director of Fish and Wildlife Service, and just people who are those decision makers in that area. They are the advisors, and then the technical team were their biologists and their field folks, their district managers, the NGO kind of staff, as well as kind of the NGO leadership around the supervisors. And so they're on the leadership team. And so you have those two levels in which, like, if the technical team of SageWest is like, we got a big question, we don't know how to deal with this, we're concerned on how to address, we send it to the advisor group. And then together, our two kind of entities, we built a charter that directs our work, kind of where we're going, what we want to see, kind of drafting, kind of vaguely year to year what we want to be working on. But kind of we had those three kind of elements of structure that made the network function and hold together.
Megan or Miyoko, do you have any other tips that you want to share? I see Paul's coming back on, so we don't have much time left.
I guess I think about just being diverse in the potential perspectives. So in that communication network that you're trying to build, what kinds of perspectives do you need on that team? Are you looking for federal representation, state representation? Are you looking for potential, like maybe local communication folks? Are you looking for certain NGOs or conservation organizations or recreational organizations? Just really trying to be strategic around bringing different folks' perspectives in so that you can get to the content that you'd like to get to and get to the end place that you would like to.
Yeah, those are all excellent insights that I've seen work really well too. And I think just one thing to layer in is when you have different organizations with different perspectives at the table, it's very helpful to have a well-defined project that everyone can collaborate in, but also to enable the flexibility because each organization or partner may need to approach it in a slightly different way. So enabling the flexibility for people to plug in according to their own objectives while having a common core purpose.
Great. Thanks so much for those excellent tips. Really helpful. And thank you as well for all of your thoughts on the panel here today. And thanks to our participants for the great questions. We are going to leave those open for a little bit here so that we can answer them. And then additionally, we're working on a process so that we can get them answered after today's session. I'm going to turn it over to Paul so that he can wrap up for the day. Thank you.
Wow. Great job, everybody. Ashley, Brant, you've hung in there all afternoon and even in the morning. So thank you so much. Great presentations, great panel discussion. I'd only close by saying lots of tools, new ideas in the biological realm as well as the social science realm for us to think about. Our challenge for all of us is to, as a boss of mine way back when said, to keep the main thing the main thing. And in the R2R, that's recovery of the species who we're worried about. So that's our metric. And we want to keep coming back to how all these tools and ideas can fulfill that for sustainable success. So looking forward to tomorrow. We're going to dig into some of the work of the species working groups. Actually going to start with some endangered species examples and work our way through a whole range of species working groups so that we can get ideas from what's worked, what hasn't worked in their arena, and see if we can build and explore together how we might produce this road to recovery process even better. So with that, I wish you a good evening and hope you will return 11 o'clock Eastern time tomorrow morning for that session, and we'll pick it up again then. Thank you again so much. Good night.